Hi everyone, my name is Eleanor King and I'm a professor at Howard University, a historically black college and university here in Washington, D.C. I am also co-founder of the Heritage Education Network, a nonprofit organization for those who use, manage, teach, or create information about the past. Today I'm here to talk to you about a part of the past that we don't often associate with archaeology, the more recent historical past. The time period we are going to visit briefly is the late 19th century, specifically the 1870s, and the place is the Guadalupe Mountains in the western part of Texas. This beautiful landscape, which is now a national park, was the scene of intense battles between the U.S. Army and the Apache during the last of the Apache Wars. Interestingly, the people fighting the Apache there were mainly the Buffalo Soldiers, the African American regiments created after the Civil War. While historians have documented this time period and they can tell us about who did what on which day, the military reports and other documents in various archives are largely silent about how the two opposing groups lived day to day. That's where archaeology can help us. And I'm here today to tell you briefly about some surprising finds we uncovered in the Guadalupe Mountains with a team of college and high school students from Howard University and the Mescalero Apache Reservation. Before getting into the archaeology, though, let me introduce you to some of the people and what they were going through. On the Apache side, you had the great Chiricahua leader Victoria, who was joined by the well-known chief Nane, then in his 80s, Cochise's son Naiche, and on and off by Geronimo, also known as Goclea, and his band, who ended up being the last Native Americans to surrender to the U.S. government in 1885. In the 1870s, however, Victoria was still alive and waging an intense guerrilla warfare campaign against the U.S. Army. The Apache were desperate. The government, as too often happened, had gone back on its promise to let them have their homeland of Ojo Caliente, or Warm Springs, in what is now New Mexico, and wanted to send them to another reservation where malaria was rampant. The Apache rightly recognized that for the death sentence that it was and fought to defend their territory. While they harassed the U.S. Army, they themselves were harassed and chased across the landscape. Women and children as well as men died, since the Apache traveled in bands with their families. It was a harrowing time. Circumstances were less dire on the other side of the conflict, but life still had its challenges. While there were European American troops stationed in the Southwest, the main military units who fought Victoria in Texas were the 10th Cavalry and the 25th Infantry, both so-called Buffalo Soldier regiments. The Cheyenne are said to have given the African American troops that nickname because the hair on their heads resembled the hair between the horns of the bison, and they had the courage of the bison, who was considered to be a formidable opponent. The men in these troops, some freemen, some former slaves, joined the army as a job to do and a way out of poverty. They were paid the same per month as their European American counterparts, and like them were housed, fed, and equipped. The black troops encountered a great deal of discrimination, however, when they were posted together with white troops in the same forts, and they suffered a number of indignities and hardships. Nonetheless, they had some of the lowest desertion rates in the army because a job was a job was a job. In fact, they took their life so stoically in stride that the artist Frederick Remington, who rode on an expedition with the 10th Cavalry, remarked that many of the white officers who led them preferred their company around the campfire to that of the other officers who spent their time complaining. You can see one of his sketches of the perils of the trail on the lower right there. These are the two groups that history tells us faced off in the Guadalupe Mountains. Guadalupe Mountains National Park, where our archaeological project took place, was first established as a park and wilderness area in the 1960s, and in 1970 was the locus for the 9th Annual Texas Archaeological Society, or TAS, field school. They were the first ones to identify what looked to be a military encampment on the lower eastern slopes of the mountains near the present-day Visitors Center. This site, then known as the Bivouac Site, is now called Pine Springs Camp. What tipped the TAS off to the idea that Pine Springs was a military facility were over 20 hearths, one of which you see in the center of the slide, lined up in a rough row with suspiciously military precision. Following the field season, Ann Fox at the TAS did extensive research in the archives of Fort Davis, Texas, and other places, and discovered that Pine Springs Camp was a well-known substation used for military operations out of Fort Davis, Fort Bliss, and other southwestern forts. Prominent among the units that had used the camp was Troop K of the 10th Cavalry, led by Captain Thomas Lebo, seen here in the lower left, who had a detachment of the 25th Infantry with him when he was there, and described the location very exactly in his report. His lieutenant made the map you see in the upper left. In the 1990s, Charlie Hecker of the National Park Service confirmed that Pine Springs was in fact a military encampment and that it had been used repeatedly by the Buffalo Soldiers. He identified a picket station overlooking the line of hearths. Upslope, near the head of Upper Pine Springs, he also found a tree with peeled bark, a food used by the Apache that suggested they had been in the area as well. It was Charlie who contacted me and proposed that we do an archaeological project together at Pine Springs Camp. The archaeological work took place under the umbrella of the Warriors Project, a program initiated in the early 2000s by the National Park Service to get African Americans and Native Americans to talk about their mutual past on the frontier. Indeed, for Native nations, the Bluecoats were the enemies, no matter the color of their skin. Like all other Army units, the Buffalo Soldiers were responsible for enforcing Uncle Sam's resettlement and containment policies, and were cordially hated for that. For African Americans, on the other hand, service in the Army was an honorable job, a path out of poverty, and a way to avoid the turmoil that roiled the eastern and southern states in the aftermath of the Civil War. To this day, African Americans look upon the Buffalo Soldiers and their service with justifiable pride. The Warriors Project aimed to have people from these different communities come together to address this difficult history. In the spirit of that enterprise, Charlie and I talked to the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer of the Mescalero Apache Tribe, Holly Houghton, to encourage Apache participation. We initiated what turned out to be a 3-year project and field school in the Guadalupe Mountains that brought together high schoolers from the Mescalero Apache Reservation, undergraduates from Howard University, and assorted high school, university, and other volunteers from the U.S. and abroad. Here are some of the cool things we found as we explored Pine Springs Camp. You've seen the hearths from the TAS pictures. Here's one of those juxtaposed onto our excavation of 2 hearths. We found that they were not all in a perfectly straight line, though they come close, because this same set of hearths was used and reused multiple times by the Buffalo Soldiers, primarily from the 10th Cavalry, and other troops who would come here to camp for a few days or a few weeks at a time. The soldiers would use Pine Springs as a base camp in which to go out and patrol in the mountains, and then return and resupply. The area had plenty of water from 2 different springs, so there was grass for the horses and pine trees for wood fires and simple construction. Excavation of the hearths demonstrated that they were carefully made and built to last. The soldiers used a heat-retaining limestone to line the edges of the fire pits, and a less brittle, flat rock on the bottom that they probably got from the ruins of a Butterfield stage station nearby. This rock is distinctive, making it easy to recognize additional hearths. In fact, we found another line of them to the north of the main one. What was not visible on the surface, however, were fireboxes, or the buried fire features you see at the bottom of the slide. They probably served 2 purposes. The one on the right we found buried underneath the hearth in the top right, and it was probably used as an oven. We found a baking soda can lid at the bottom. The one on the left was visible only as a small cluster of rocks on the surface, too little to be a hearth, but too carefully placed to be natural. When we excavated it, we found that it extended quite a bit below ground, as you can see. It was probably a heating box used both to cook and to protect the fire from the high winds that could blow down through the camp from the nearby mountain pass. Tent pads were another big discovery. Some were near hearths, but many were farther away. They had different construction. One large one, seen here on the left in the middle, had a chimney, which is now the pile of rubble you see at the back of the picture. It may have housed an infirmary tent or something else of use to the whole camp. These tents would probably have been made of canvas and conical, like the ones in the archival picture, and they would not have had a floor, so they would have had to have been picked down. With the high winds in this area, this would have been a good idea in any case. One exciting find was a peg still firmly in the ground next to one tent pad. In situ here means in place. Materials found with it date it to the right time period to have been used by the Buffalo Soldiers. One of the most fascinating discoveries that we made during excavation, besides the fireboxes, were hypocausts. They are underground channels that run from a surface fire underneath a nearby feature, in this case a tent pad, to heat it without the danger of having it catch on fire. The Romans used these, and other armies have too. Heat from the outside firebox or campfire would have heated up the ground where the men slept, making it more comfortable in the late fall and early spring when the Buffalo Soldiers camped here. Inside the firebox of the one on the left, we found a stash of can lids where the tent's occupants had parked them after opening up what was probably their nightly can of beans, a U.S. Army staple, to heat it. Other exciting finds indicated military activity areas aside from their places for eating and sleeping. Metal remains and a profusion of horseshoe nails marked a spot where a blacksmith reshoed horses, probably using a portable forge. Cavalry horses often threw shoes in the rough mountainous terrain, and we know that Captain Lebo, for one, always insisted on having a blacksmith travel with him. We also found several more picket stations, including the one pictured here, and artifacts near the main line of hearths, one of which, at least, the quarter you see, was contemporaneous with the Buffalo Soldiers' use of the camp. It is dated 1875. Even more exciting than the military finds was the abundant evidence for Apache use of Pine Springs as well. We had known they were in the area, of course, as several different native groups regularly traveled to the Guadalupe Mountains, both before and after European contact. When he visited the site in the 1990s, Charlie had already tentatively identified the characteristic circle of stones that marked the emplacement of a wickiup, the traditional Apache brush shelter. What we weren't prepared for, however, was the extent and depth of occupation. We excavated one wickiup that had no less than 4 hearths buried within it that were used at different times. One had a large can lid, the same type of can lid we found stashed in the hypocaust firebox, but the center of this one had been carefully cut out, probably so that the tin could be used to make the jingles that decorated regalia. Next to the military hearths, we found additional evidence for Apache reuse of military materials. The bottom of a glass bottle that had been reshaped into a scraper, probably for working hides, and a cartridge cut to hold gunpowder. Clearly, the Apache waited until the soldiers had gone and then searched the area for useful items left behind. Since the soldiers were there very intermittently, the Apache would have had ample time to do so. We also found several burned rock middens, which are the remnants of fire roasting pits for mescal primarily. The mescal cactus was a staple for the Apache especially because once roasted, it would last a long time and was easily portable as they moved from place to place. The roasting process itself was slow, though, taking several days, and the smoke was visible for miles, making them vulnerable to attack during the time of the Apache Wars. Nonetheless, they were apparently able to continue carrying out some of these activities at Pine Springs and in the surrounding area, apparently contemporaneously with the Buffalo Soldiers' occasional presence. In sum, what we found at Pine Springs Camp was a window onto the lifeways and activities of 2 very different past groups of people that we only know in broad strokes from the history books. They shared this space like you would a modern timeshare, using it at different moments to avoid each other. And what was not to like? Changes in underground water channels have now largely dried up the springs and turned the surrounding area into high desert. Back in the day, though, Pine Springs would have offered abundant fresh water, grass, plants, animals to hunt, and other amenities to the wary traveler. The surprise is not that both groups used this space, but that they managed not to bump into each other that often. The wickiup rings, tent pads, hearths, and activity areas all show steady, if discontinuous, use and point to the importance this site had for both Buffalo Soldiers and Apaches. In uncovering that untold history, archaeology helps to give us a much more vivid picture of what life was like for both these groups, whose descendants are still very much around today. I want to thank the organizations and individuals listed here who all made this project possible. If you're interested in learning further about archaeology or would like some guidance on how to use it in a classroom or a visitor's tour or any other activity, please check out these resources. Look at the next slide for books you may enjoy on the Buffalo Soldiers and the Apache. Thank you for your time. It's been fun spending these archaeological minutes with you.